Hi, my name is Dr. Paul T. Carter. Thank you for joining me today. I'm going to reveal to you in this video a recent discovery regarding ancient Angkor or Khmer warfighting. Of all the texts, articles, books I have written, this remains one of the most popular downloads. And I'm not for sure why, other than perhaps people are fascinated with the grandeur of the ancient civilization, the magnificence of Angkor Thom and Angkor Wat. Now, this discovery I made eluded previous researchers, but I think it's only because others had not been looking. It's only been in the past 25 years that researchers have taken a second look at ancient Southeast Asian warfare, the first being Wales in 1952 with his classic Ancient Southeast Asian Warfare. Others have peer-reviewed my work. First, I was very fortunate during this project to be under the tutelage of Dr. Sunate Chutintaranon, among the world's leading authorities of Southeast Asian warfare and arguably the world's authority on ancient Thai and Burmese warfare. Heralded Southeast Asian civilization specialists such as Kent Davis have featured my work. A Southeast Asian archaeological website chose to post my finding, and I did present my findings to the Siam Society in 2018. Amazingly, we know very little about the great Angkor civilization, and archaeologists continue to discover new Angkor settlements. In fact, we have come to find that the Angkor civilization was much larger than anyone would have guessed, and research in just the last decade has resulted in an astounding five-fold increase in the number of identified temples. The format I will follow today is that first, I will tell you what warfare discovery I made. Next, I will give you some quick background on the Angkor Empire, then restate my discovery in more detail, present evidence to support, and finally, I will offer some possible explanations for the discovery I made. For my finding, I argue that the preponderance of available evidence, small of a body as it is, suggests that at no time did Angkor's kings conduct defensive warfare practices that other civilizations had used in earlier centuries. There are no indications that Khmer kings in the classic Angkor period, roughly AD 802 to 1327, ever constructed adequate defenses or practiced defensive warfare techniques beyond the massive Angkor Thom with its walls and moat. The lack of defensive warfare application is a quite striking omission given the grandeur and expanse of the empire and its ambitious offensive war operations. What I mean here is that in warfare there are offensive operations where an army moves forward to seize terrain, and the Khmer army certainly did that. The offensive is the preferred military operation, not just for advancing the empire, but it forces the enemy to react to events that the offensive army controls. And there are defensive operations where one protects the empire. Defensive operations are less preferred, but they are sometimes required, and so defensive preparations such as defense in depth and early warning are required. So I am speaking of the lack of defense for the Angkor capital. Now, some background and a very short film on the Western discovery of Angkor.
The Khmer culture originated in the northwestern part of present-day Cambodia. The first Khmer dynasty was founded here in the 9th century.
In 1860, a French naturalist was cutting his way through the Cambodian jungle in search of exotic insects. Henri Mouot suddenly came across the last thing he was expecting: a massive complex of stone temples. Mouot had stumbled across one of the world's most astonishing and enduring architectural feats: the 900-year-old remains of Angkor Wat.
The map on the left represents modern-day Southeast Asia, while the map on the right shows the extent of the Angkor Empire during its zenith, probably around the 12th century. You see the Pagan Empire to the northwest, today's Myanmar, and the Shams to the east, populated the Champa Empire. In 1471, the Vietnamese, from the north, essentially exterminated the Champa Empire, probably killing up to 120,000 Chams, reducing them to a small enclave at Nha Trang in central Vietnam, with others fleeing to Cambodia. The Chams are a contemporary population, largely Muslim, living roughly from Kampong Cham province, Cambodia, to about Nha Trang in central Vietnam. Here you see the southern migration of the Vietnamese as they expanded from their home in the Red River Valley in the north, down the peninsula, conquering everything in front of them. The Vietnamese always needed more land for a crowded population, unlike the Thai, who historically had more land than people. The map on the right shows Angkor's position in northwest Cambodia in the Siem Reap area on the Tonle Sap Lake. Angkor Wat is a Khmer temple from the 12th century and is probably the most famous and complete temple in the Siem Reap area. And Angkor Thom is from the slightly later 12th and 13th centuries, the heart of the empire and a walled city-state with various temples, the Bayon being the best known. It also has many other features, including some great gates and causeways and temples. Over 5 centuries, Angkor grew to a city comparable in size to modern-day Los Angeles, though with a much lower population density. Bernard Philippe Grosley in 1979 viewed Angkor as a hydraulic city. Based upon his calculations, Angkor had around 1.9 million inhabitants, certainly a megacity at the time, although other archaeologists state that number is greatly exaggerated and put the number at 100,000 or so. Water regulation was through large reservoirs called barrages, with inlet and outlet control structures used both in drought and flooding. The 4 largest were West, East, Preah Khan, or Jayatataka, and Indratataka. From a Google Earth satellite view, you can clearly still see the outlines of the barrages from space. The Hindu religion from India, which came to Southeast Asia between the 1st and 5th centuries, and Hinduism's polytheistic idea mixed well with animism, which was the original indigenous spiritual practice and worldview. Buddhism was a powerful influence which came a bit later, certainly by the 5th century, and today Cambodia, like Thailand and Laos, practice a mixture of Hinduism, Buddhism, and animism. Another life-changing event came through the Thai, or Siamese, of Ayutthaya, who invaded and fought at Angkor 2, possibly 3, times, finally sacking the Khmer capital in the early 15th century. Here is a general timeline of the civilization compared with Western events. You see that Angkor was founded around the time of Charlemagne. The civilization reached its peak, the height of its grandeur, around the time the Magna Carta was signed in England. 2 events were probably harbingers of Angkor decline. The Thai, at their first kingdom of Sukhothai in today's Thailand, overthrew their Khmer ruler, and the first of 3 droughts hit the Khmer at Angkor. Finally, the Thai of Ayutthaya, the second Siamese capital, sacking of Angkor was a debilitating event around the time of the 100 Years' War in Europe. To discuss Angkor defensive warfighting, one must analyze the military aspects of terrain. Prominent terrain features located near the city were natural obstacles to an invading army's movement, meaning an approaching enemy had a limited number of avenues of approach into the area. To the south, approximately 9 kilometers, was the Great Lake. To the north was a mountain range, the Kulin Hills, approximately 22 kilometers from Angkor. There is a narrow pass there, approximately 1.25 kilometers wide, through which an enemy could attack. But with proper defenses, it would be a risky endeavor, as attacking forces would be highly canalized. Certainly this narrow pass could provide early warning of an approaching enemy force, and with some defense would mean an invading enemy could be primarily restricted to eastern or western approaches. The rice growing areas were extremely large, the most concentrated near the lake, but the fields intermittently stretched from the Great Lake to the Kulin Hills, presenting obstacles for movement, particularly during the rainy season, but even the dry season, due to embankments and moats. A key to defense is not just to use terrain features in themselves as obstacles to slow or impede the enemy's movement. Rather, you tie in defenses. You integrate terrain with your defensive positions in such a way that they all complement the other. Ronald Fletcher, in his The Dynamics of Angkor and Its Landscape journal article, describes the area as one of a, quote, network of canals, road embankments, moats, and barre. The surface area was sandy and prone to flooding during the rainy season. Numerous streams and lakes traverse the area, making much of the area impassable and a swamp. The water table in the area is so high that virtually the entire region would have been inundated during the rainy season. Integrating obstacles with existing terrain is an effective and necessary military technique. There is no evidence Khmer kings did this, as other civilizations did. A king or military commander could construct defenses oriented on the restricted natural terrain that the enemy had to traverse. Did the Khmer possess the knowledge to manipulate terrain to conduct such a task? One archaeologist says yes.
When you start looking at the radar imagery and you see the sophistication with which they were able to control and alter their terrain, I've never seen a culture like it elsewhere in Southeast Asia in terms of manipulating the landscape, of using it to their benefit.
To briefly restate my primary argument, there are no indications that any Khmer kings in the classic Angkor period ever constructed defenses beyond the massive Angkor tomb with its wall and moat. Angkor's physical defenses are characterized by a quadrangle of walls approximately 8 meters high, 12-kilometer long, surrounded by a 100-meter wide moat. It was certainly a significant improvement over previous Khmer defenses, yet, as one writer wrote, quote, "There is some debate as to the functionality of Angkor tomb as a whole. If it was a wall intended for defense, it was rather poorly designed, since there is nowhere along the wall for defenders to take refuge from incoming fire or shoot back from a shielded location," unquote. In fact, there seems to be a lack of defensive warfare practices in other Khmer fortresses. One study of a Khmer complex, currently located in Thailand, found that, quote, "the stone walls were not designed primarily to resist military attacks," unquote. And it further states, quote, "All this symbolism determined several aspects of the fortified walls, such as the shape, size, proportion, and exact location of the gateways," unquote. Thus, the study concluded that military factors were not the primary considerations in wall construction, which is a striking finding. Angkor lacked some of the key defensive features that Indian defenses from earlier centuries had possessed. We know from ancient writings and archaeology that Indian defenses, predating and contemporary with Angkor, used mutually supporting ramparts and defense in depth, which is a key defensive practice then and now. Indian measures included walls with watchtowers at the gates, multiple moats, separate watchtowers apart from the city, loopholes in the walls, and on ramparts from which archers could shoot at attacking enemies, and even engines to hurl missiles at attacking enemies. Indian writings and archaeology not only talk about towers and guards, moats, thorny bushes, and separate towers, but also the use of spies, sentinels, and dogs for early warning. Defense in depth is such a critical defensive measure, it is even used today in cybersecurity. The moat surrounding the Hindu city of Madurai was said to have a thick jungle of thorny trees. Many ancient Indian cities took advantage of natural terrain features, protecting the city approach with thorny bushes, sharp instruments, and entanglements of various kinds. None of these features are known to have been incorporated into Angkor's defense. At this point, we must ask a key question. That is, would the Khmer have known about defensive warfare practiced by other civilizations? The answer is yes. Numerous written and archaeological sources exist concerning ancient Indian or Hindu warfighting. These largely relate to 3rd and 4th century BC warfighting techniques and include accounts from Greek writers, Chinese pilgrims, the Muslim Muhammadan chronicles, the Ramayana, Mahabharata, and Niti. Archaeology also provides some insights, and we should not be surprised that the Khmer would have known of Hindu warfighting techniques, as the Indian influence upon Southeast Asia is well documented. Evidence of Indian ideas and traditions continue today in kinships, religion, and literature, so almost certainly war. Southeast Asia is commonly referred to by many scholars as Hinduized states, reflected in a book by Georges Soudez, a 20th century French scholar of Southeast Asian archaeology and history. The most comprehensive Hindu text on warfighting reveals that defensive warfare techniques were known prior to this classic Angkor period. They were written in the authoritative Indian text Arthashastra, a handbook for running an empire, written for the first ruler of the Mauryan Empire. It was written by Kautilya, a professor, Indian statesman and philosopher, chief advisor and prime minister of the Indian Emperor Chandragupta, considered a hero in India today. Noted Khmer authority Michel Jacques Ergouache states the Khmers during this time certainly knew of the text. In fact, all authors who have written on Khmer warfighting during the classic period believe the Khmers were familiar with the text. There were striking similarities between the Arthashastra's prescription for battle formations and bas-reliefs, or temple carvings, depicting such formations at Angkor Wat. Wells, who I quoted earlier, observes that in the depictions of a naval battle on the Bante Shamar reliefs, Bante Shamar is a Khmer temple complex about 20 kilometers south of the Thai border, both the Khmer and Cham rowers are facing the rear, which is the Indian way of naval battle and contrary to the Chinese way. The Arthashastra outlines the principles of a defense in depth. The Arthashastra defines a defense in depth both for early warning and to slow and degrade an enemy, and states not only is the fort important, but other defensive works. The document states outside this, meaning outside the fort walls, hunters and keepers of dogs with their trumpets and with fire, also spies and sentinels, also to prevent the attack of enemies, wells, mounds, and thorns should be arranged. The Arthashastra considered defense to be such an important principle that it states when a king goes on the offensive, he should leave 1/3 or 1/4 of his army to protect his base of operations. Hindu texts make it clear that standing armies existed in northern India preceding the classic Angkor period. Chakravarti, in his noted work, The Art of War in Ancient India, states it is certain that in the 4th century BC, when Alexander the Great invaded India, standing armies had become a normal feature of Indian military life. It is understandable that during this period Khmer kings would be reluctant to leave a standing army given the unstable political environment with coups and counter-coups. Only 8 out of 26 Angkor rulers were brothers or sons of their predecessors, meaning the tradition of succession was supplanted by the tradition of the sword. Nonetheless, failing to adequately prepare for the defense of Angkor left it more vulnerable to enemy attack. The ancient Pew, the earliest inhabitants of today's Myanmar, whose civilization flourished from the 1st to the 9th century AD, understood defense as they employed a defensive weapon for use near their cities called a drop claw. Yu Nguyen Hun, Former Myanmar Director General of Archaeology drew this illustration for me. This is a pronged defensive utensil whose prong or barb will stand upright no matter how the drop claw is placed on the ground. The Pew used these to inhibit the advance of attacking armies against their cities, as the claw would injure men and horses. You told me that drop claws have been unearthed outside the city walls of Bactano, Halen, and C. Cresta. A significance of the Pew use of a drop claw is that it demonstrates the Pew practiced defensive warfare techniques, certainly in the form of early warning of an approaching enemy, because one would not deploy the drop claw unless there was information of an approaching enemy, as the claw does not discriminate between friend and foe. We know more about Angkor than we otherwise would because of a Chinese diplomat, Zhao Duguan, stationed at Angkor in 1296. He is most well known for his accounts of life at Angkor. His portrayal is one of the most important sources for understanding Angkor and the Khmer Empire at the time. He paints a fairly sorry example of soldier readiness and Khmer defensive preparation. He says, "The soldiers too go naked and barefoot. In the right hand they carry a lance, and in their left a shield. They have nothing that could be called bows and arrows, trebuchets, body armor, helmets, or the like. I have heard reports that when the Siamese attacked, all the ordinary people were ordered out to do battle, often with no good strategy or preparation." Zhao lacks specificity and context in his conclusion. We don't know if he meant a local sudden attack or if there was a true lack of strategy and preparation, possibly due to the king having lost power for other reasons. While Khmer kings may have lost some measure of control by this time, Zhao does mention that the Khmer at least had night watchmen, presumably at the city gates, divided among 4 watches, which indicates some order and command and control. Jayavarman VII, the Khmer king responsible for Angkor tomb construction, was also responsible for massive building programs, and these included most of the empire's road network and rest house system. There were several primary arteries, all radiating from Angkor except for one. Wales states these were likely excellent roads and used for military purposes. There were 57 rest houses at regular intervals, for example, on the road to Champa. Road networks are useful for empires, but enemy forces can use them as well. Having sentinels positioned along these road networks, particularly at the rest houses, would have provided the opportunity for early warning, and certainly sentinels would not be an armed threat to the king. We have no evidence that sentinels were placed at these rest stops, although they certainly could have, and there not be evidence of it. Given Ayutthaya used the road network in its attack on Angkor, placing sentinels along the route would have been prudent. Let's review what the Arthashastra prescribed and the Indians and Khmer practiced. As is shown here, the Indians practiced every precept the Arthashastra prescribes, while the Khmer at Angkor used almost none. This unquestionably would have placed them at a definite disadvantage on warfighting and would have rendered the capital vulnerable to attack. Before I offer explanations of why the Khmer kings may not have used proper defensive warfare techniques, I want to tell you what the experts say were the possible causes for the empire, as it was known, to fall. I do not argue that the unemployment of defensive warfare application caused the demise of the empire, although it certainly could and may have contributed to it. There are several theories for the demise of the empire. First, the Angkor civilization had engineered quite a sophisticated hydrology system, and the city was reliant upon the proper functioning of this system. One theory is that climate change may have caused the destruction of this fragile water system. Archaeologists and paleo-environmentalists have documented that severe droughts, one in the early 13th century and extended droughts between the 14th and 15th centuries, followed by a heavy monsoon, did damage the hydro system. Another theory is that the known conversion in the 14th and 15th centuries from Mahayana to Theravada Buddhism may have immobilized the king's ability to govern, and the society broke down. Those disadvantaged by the change included the high-ranking Hindu and Mahayana priestly families who had built and maintained the temples at Angkor. But there are two theories that do relate to war. One is that the battles between the Thai of Ayutthaya and the Khmer that took place on top of Angkor destroyed the fragile water system. The second is that the men who were responsible for the maintenance of this fragile water system were called into battle, therefore neglecting the water system. Now, if these two theories are true, then one could argue that had the Khmer practiced proper defensive warfare techniques, such as defense in depth or early warning, then they could have mitigated the effects of battle that occurred at Angkor and almost certainly destroyed the delicate infrastructure. There is no doubt that repeated war with the Thai of Ayutthaya threatened Angkor's very survival. You can't sack a city after a prolonged siege, as the Thai did in the early 15th century, without debilitating effects upon the infrastructure. Almost certainly battles fought at Angkor between Ayutthaya and the Khmers contributed to the destruction of the fragile irrigation and canal system. Another war theory postulates that Ayutthaya's certain use of the road network that Angkor built hastened the Thai ability to deploy into Angkor. Again, with early warning, which we have no evidence of, and proper defenses, this liability would have been mitigated. Now I'm going to provide for you plausible explanations for why the ancient Khmer kings did not employ proper defensive warfare techniques. Now this is, I think, the weakest part of my argument because I am applying a 21st century Western mindset to the motives of ancient Hindu, Buddhist, Khmer kings. And there's so much about Angkor that we just do not know. For example, and I'll just give you one example here as an illustration for this. At Angkor, there is one-stepped pyramid called Baksay Shamkrong. Now, it is really an anomaly because it's the only one. It seems to predate Angkor, and also there's some strange phenomena about its construction. Now, Baksay Shamkrong is almost identical to Tikal in Guatemala, the ancient Mayan stepped pyramid. Now, if these two pyramids were, say, 100 kilometers apart, archaeologists would almost certainly say they were constructed by the same people. Also, there's some ancient Mayan and Hindu texts that seem to relate the two civilizations together. In fact, the word Mayan is a Hindu word, a Tamil word, meaning illusion or magic. Here are three possible reasons for the Khmer neglect of defensive warfare. First, did Jayavarman VII consider the best defense an offense? One reason that Khmer kings may have ignored defensive measures is that they believed attacking an enemy forward was the best way to defend one's empire. There is the old military adage, quote, "The best defense is an offense," unquote. Jayavarman VII 32 years of war with the Shams may indicate he believed in the virtue of forward offensive operations. Wars with Siam, the Thai, fought at Angkor, should have taught the Khmer the need for defense. In any sense, perhaps kings thought they could completely vanquish their enemies on the offense. 2. Did the Khmer simply lack the military know-how and thus purposely ignore defensive precepts? Michael Coe observes, quote, Zhao Daguan was unimpressed by Khmer military know-how, denigrating it with the brief statement, "Generally speaking, these people have neither discipline nor strategy," unquote. To be fair, by the time of Zhao, there could have been some semblances of breakdown of Khmer society. Wales states the Khmers, quote, claim to be the masters of the artifices of war, even though, as we have seen, they scorned them, unquote. This statement was based, however, upon the alleged Sham navigation up the Tonle Sap to attack Angkor, an episode that some doubt. Now keep in mind, Zhao almost certainly would have considered the Khmer inferior to the Chinese and could be expected to make disparaging remarks. So Lang and Beling Ok, Khmer and Chinese, are the new authors of the first translation of Zhao's account from Khmer and Chinese sources. They point out that Zhao may have been speculating on areas out of his direct experience, and the Chinese, like most observers in foreign lands, were very ethnocentric and felt superior to lesser civilizations. They note that bas-reliefs at the Bayon show soldiers with bows and arrows, and that other Bayon bas-reliefs show, in addition to bows and arrows and crossbows, ballistae, an ancient missile weapon that launched stones at a distant target, on the back of elephants and carts. So the bottom line is, we don't know how accurate Zhao's account is. Nonetheless, it is certainly reasonable to suggest that Khmer kings simply overlooked sound defensive principles because they were not militarily sophisticated enough to understand their importance, despite reminders all around them. Finally, did the Khmer overly rely upon mystical forces? It is certainly plausible that the Khmer kings believed in mystical forces for the defense of Angkor, and that these were all that was necessary to defend the complex. Wall construction, just like at the Khmer Pimai complex in Thailand, seems to have had other purposes. The Angkor Thom South Gate, for example. On both sides of the causeway are railings with 54 stone figures performing a famous Hindu story, the myth of the churning of the ocean. Perhaps these were placed here for protection against enemy invaders. Wales states, quote, "War magic and the quest for invulnerability no doubt formed a major part of the military preparations of Khmer and Sham soldiers of all ranks," unquote. Magic swords and magic formulas were thought to make one invincible. Perhaps the same thought pertained to fortifications as well, and that gods and magic were more powerful protectors than physical defenses. In conclusion, there is not a body of evidence to provide an answer, but this lack of defense is certainly a curious oversight. Most likely it was a combination of several of these aforementioned factors. For those of you with more eclectic tastes concerning Angkor, you might enjoy watching the 1936 horror, romance, and war movie called Revolt of the Zombies. I posted the URL in the comments section. You can watch it for free. It is an English language movie. The film is set during World War I. A French-Cambodian contingent had heard strange stories about zombification. Supposedly Angkor Wat was built by utilizing zombies, and there are tales of zombie armies easily overcoming foes. The protagonist brings back a priest who supposedly knows the secret of zombification, but he won't talk. So the protagonist and an international military contingent head to Angkor Wat on an archaeological expedition designed to discover the secret of zombification and destroy the information before zombies have a chance to, quote, wipe out the white race, unquote. Well, thank you very much for joining me today. I will now provide where to download my material, and I always look forward to your critical feedback. Don't hesitate to email me. From Bangkok, always remember,